Good evening and welcome to this evening's episode of Life with Liliana and Friends. We are in season 5 and this is episode 2. We're talking with my beautiful daughter, Bolo Arieta Melania Lomalangi Tora. Thank you again, Melania, for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me again, Mom.
Man, you're just the best. You are the best guest ever. I wish I could have her every week. But today, we're going to be continuing this conversation on trauma. And like we mentioned last week, we found in the spaces that we've been in as a family during this season that trauma has been a key influencer in a lot of the social problems that we are seeing. But not only that, for all of us, we established last week, and I hope everybody has watched last week's episode and had an opportunity to digest it and to think about your own situations, because I'm convinced that all of us have experienced trauma in some way. Now, today we're going to talk specifically about healing. Right? The first step to healing, my brilliant daughter always says, is to identify or to become aware that there is a problem. Now, I just want to add before she comes on that Melania talks about trauma because she's currently studying the area of psychology. She is a postgraduate student at the University of Canterbury. She's studying online, so she's almost done for the year, then she will go on and do her master's. She's graduated with a Bachelor in Arts majoring in psychology last year from Deakin University, and she graduated with distinction because she is brilliant. So we're going to carry on and talk about healing. So this is the most important part, right? And we all heal in different ways, but we're going to hear from Melania and just try and understand what we can take away for ourselves, what practical tools that we can take away and equip ourselves on this journey. So Nia, we've talked about what trauma is. We've talked about why it's important to identify it, and you spoke about 3 key things that might indicate that we've experienced some trauma. You talked about getting flashbacks, intrusive flashbacks or bad experiences that we might have gone through. You also mentioned it affects our ability to function, and the everyday things. And the last thing you said is that we tend to isolate ourselves if we've been through trauma. So talk us through how we can heal.
Right. So healing is a long and time-consuming journey. It's also very painful because, like you said, we're identifying that it's affecting us, and that can be really confronting.
Yes.
Looking at your own experiences and looking at and how you've acted out of that hurt, it can be very confronting, especially when facing yourself. The first step to healing, I believe, is, like you said, identifying that we have gone through trauma, and no matter what other people say, really sticking by what we feel and what we know that we've experienced, right? Because a lot of times, especially in our community, we can allow people to say that, oh, you haven't really experienced, like you're over-exaggerating. And it invalidates our emotions.
Invalidates,
it makes us
that's the word.
Second guess ourselves and our own experience, but we have to remember we went through it, we experienced it, they went there. And when we were talking about trauma, looking at trauma as a serious injury, if someone comes up to you and you've got a broken leg and they say, you don't have a broken leg, like, I'm looking at you and I think it's not a big deal. Obviously you're going to say, no, that's wrong. I experienced it. My leg is broken.
I can feel the pain.
I can feel the pain, and you went there, so I know what I'm feeling.
So
we have to have the same confidence in our own experiences and really be firm in saying, I feel this has affected me. Another point in that, in this first stage, is also just being really honest with yourself. I think a lot of people, especially, I know I do this for sure, is I always want to portray the best version of myself, and I always want to put my best image forward in every situation. And I think that we sometimes get caught up in our own image and trying to show people that life is all good, and we try even to convince ourselves that everything's okay, but that's not what life is about, right? Everybody goes through bad experiences, and I think this will also help when we're interacting with people, not one person goes through life unscathed.
Yes.
Everyone goes through something
Yes.
bad. So I think it's really important to have grace for yourself, but also others in that way. Just seeing them through that lens that they're acting this way because something may have happened to them. So there's a root cause there.
And it's interesting you say that, because you know how there's all these conversations about, on social media. And we always, there's filters, there's things like that kind of encourage that you would put the best. But then what we don't think about is that's actually not your best. Because you're not at your best.
And that's not you.
That's not
really
you.
Not an accurate image of
you're not okay, right? And you had said last week when you were speaking about this topic is it's okay not to be okay. And that's fine. But then we're now on the second part, which we're going to talk about, but it is not okay to stay that way. Just before we move on to a few things that can help us with this healing, I want to just stress this part to our viewers. When Melania said that we often, sometimes we are invalidated when we say to people that we are hurting or we went through this trauma. I've certainly experienced that myself as well. And I think also when you're in a group, I'm sure we all have this close friends group where sometimes we sit and we talk about our different traumatic experiences, and one of them might say, well, I was abused, for example, when I was a child. And then if you were to come along and say, well, I used to hear my parents fighting all the time, like one can easily feel like, okay, but yours is not as bad as mine, like your trauma is less important or less of a trauma, so just get on with your lives. But what you said, if I'm correct, is that that's absolutely wrong. It's subjective, and your trauma is also important. It's not less than anybody else's. Yes?
Yes, that's right.
Wonderful. So Nia, we're going to heal. Nia, we need to heal.
Right.
Tell us.
The second part of the healing stage is obviously just getting really deep into what you've experienced and acknowledging and identifying just where it has affected you, right? And this is just like the first stage, very confronting, because usually when we experience trauma, it's at the hand of another person. And so this is where forgiveness comes in, and trying to forgive that person, not for them but for yourself, because you still harbor all that hurt and all that pain, and it robs you of that joy that you're meant to be living in, right? And so I think that forgiving that other person is really more for yourself and your own healing journey than it is for them, because a lot of the time that person is off doing, living their own life, and so it's hard to let go of that bitterness, but I think it's absolutely necessary. And another part of that forgiveness, I think, is forgiving yourself. A lot of the times we blame ourselves for what we've gone through, and I think it's completely wrong, because we're not meant to harbor the blame for what we've been through. It's not our fault, and we have to come to terms with that. We also have to come to terms with the fact that it may have affected our relationships with other people. And if we let trauma guide our behavior, it's 100% certain that it has affected our loved ones and the people we love the most. And it's a shame that we would pass on that hurt that we felt to the people we love. So I think forgiveness in that part is forgiving yourself for acting out of hurt and acting in that way, but also forgiving yourself for thinking that it was your fault and taking the blame for that.
So important. But in order to do that, we need to allow ourselves. So you're saying we actually have to, are you saying that we have to relive and think through that trauma and what happened and address it that way?
Yeah, and that's why it's so painful, because nobody wants to experience or relive the worst experiences of their life. And so really digging deep into ourselves and remembering that, even if we've been having flashbacks, it's only like a flash in our minds, right? This is going down to exactly what we've been through, what happened, who was involved, and how it has affected us till that point, till the present.
So it makes sense now when you're describing it that way that we should engage someone professional.
Yes, and that's the third step to healing. I think.
Did we do two?
We did two.
Which one did we do? So get
to identify it, and then get deep into it. Start with the forgiveness, and then the third part is to seek professional help, or to seek help. I think a really huge help, especially when dealing with trauma, is talking to someone.
Okay.
Going through trauma, I think that, like I said, we tend to isolate ourselves, and so just by admitting it or allowing ourselves to like admit that it's actually happened to another person that we feel safe with and that we trust, can help relieve a lot of that hurt and a lot of that pain that we've been feeling.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when we talk to someone, I think this is great advice. And you know what's interesting here is it's so simple.
Yeah.
Like it's nothing. This is not rocket science.
Yeah.
First, identify. So there's a lot of work that we need to do ourselves first before
Yeah.
we heal. Okay, identify. Yes, this happened to me. Yes, this is important. Let me just think through what happened here and the roles of the different people. So release forgiveness if we can, but sometimes we need help in releasing forgiveness, don't we? And then you went in to talk about talking to someone. So we can have, sometimes we have friends that we often talk to. I think that's very, very common. My experience has been when I had, you know, like in my days of trying to figure out where I was, the friends I had around me at that time were not actually helping me. And as I've gone on, now that I can recognize it, I see it in so many spaces. Like a lot of them just help me hate on the other person. Like, you're right, and good thing you did this, and they this. That's actually not helpful, because I always come away from those spaces and those conversations really not feeling good about myself. Or maybe I feel good for a little while, but it's not a lasting one. So when it comes to, I really want to hear your thoughts on professional help, because that's not something that's common. So what do you feel like in Fiji, if you had a close friend that was in this space, how would you direct them? Where would you direct them to get help?
Right. So I think that now in Fiji we have a lot more resources than we did, and it's just the fact that we don't really talk about it that stops us from realizing that all these resources are there. So we have like Lifeline, we have the Child Helpline, we have counseling services are a lot more common than they were.
We have Hope Clinic.
We have Hope Clinic, and we have a bunch of licensed professionals that are able to help us. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that and to allow ourselves to open up, because we often don't think that they would understand what we're going through, but just like a physical injury, you trust a professional to treat it. You don't rely on your own abilities to try and treat that injury. And so thinking of it in the aspect of mental trauma, it's the same thing. We have to rely on people that know more and that have experienced multiple
and I think you mentioned that word licensed, which is really important, because I think sometimes you also fall into the trap of speaking to people who say they're counselors, but they don't actually have the proper training. And so I do know for a fact that the counselors at the Hope Clinic, which is just one example, so I myself, like in my journey, have sought the help of counselors. And you know, like you said, you go in thinking, oh, they won't understand, and you know, I'm gonna sound stupid. And it just amazed me at how common my problem was. And when I realized that it was so common, it actually took a huge weight off my shoulders, because it didn't make me feel like you're the only one in the world who has been through this and feels like this. I'm like, okay, so these are normal reactions to the trauma that I've been through. And I really believe that using professional counselors, seeing them, getting alongside one, changed everything, or changed so much for me. Really, and it took years. It was a really difficult journey though. So Nia, I would really love if we could just change the tone a little bit and talk a little bit more about you, because you know, we've all experienced trauma. Would you be able to share an experience, so that just to bring it to life for us?
Yeah, I'd love to. So in my own experience, I think we both experienced this actually. It's kind of like a shared trauma between us. But when I was growing up, I was about 6 years old when my parents separated. Well, apparently I was 6 years old. I didn't know that they had separated.
Okay, we've been through that. Okay, you've already said that live on the episode.
But they were separated, apparently. And we moved back into our family home, my mom's family home, and we lived with my grandfather and he was just a lovely man. Rest his soul, he's in heaven now, and he was just such an amazing man. But he struggled with alcoholism, and I think our whole family has had to struggle with that. It's definitely a generational thing. But when he would get drunk, he would just turn into a different person in my 6-year-old eyes. He was like completely different from his sober self. And so he'd come back and he'd, my mom and I, you and I, we shared a room. And so he would come back and he would knock on the door really loudly, and he'd yell. And he was very verbally abusive in that time. He'd be, sorry, this is only my second time sharing it. Like when we do talk about trauma, the first time or the first few times comes out very emotionally, and that's okay. But when we were going through that, it was really terrifying to me as a 6-year-old, because I just couldn't match the two of him, his behaviors up, his personalities, because I just thought in my mind, how could the man that sees me come back from school, who makes my dinner, who loves on me so much during the day, during that same day come home and tell my mom and I that we don't belong there, that, you know, we're not wanted there. And it was really traumatic for me, and that really conditioned me to later on in life, when I smell beer, especially, not just alcohol but beer specifically, and when I hear loud voices, or even if it's just a happy occasion, or like if someone shouts, it startles me a lot more than it usually would, especially with the alcohol. With the smell of alcohol, it really brings up a lot of hurt, and it makes me uncomfortable in that moment, and it just makes me feel very unsafe. But I think as I've gotten older and I've continuously been around spaces with alcohol, I think that it has really helped to kind of numb that response down, because I've been continuously exposed to situations that include alcohol. So it's definitely not as bad as it was when I was like 10 years old.
And I suppose like alcohol in our home now is very different from then, you know? It's
controlled.
Like to come home and then have a beer while making dinner and all. So that's why it's different. But how have you healed? Like, I mean, and you probably may not have completely healed. You might find it in some instances, but what steps have you taken, because you've been able to identify it? Right.
So even before I even knew that I was like, this was such a huge part of like how I was behaving, when I was 15 we started going to connect groups, or we started hosting connect groups, which is basically like a fellowship with believers, or a few non-believers like were there, and we would it was just basically a space to be open and honest about our experiences and helping each other through that pain. And I think that that was really important in sharing my experience and talking about it over and over, and seeing how other people related to it was just so fascinating to me. But the connect groups were really just a way to connect me to God. That was where I found really healing in every area. And I think that the good thing about giving your healing journey to God is that He knows you better than you know yourself. And I think that obviously when we speak to people, we tend to have that wall up. There's always something that we don't share, or we don't feel comfortable sharing, or it could be something that's buried deep within us. And I think that the good thing with God is that He knows everything about us. He knows our thoughts, He knows our heart, and He still loves us, and He still calls us His own. And He walks through us through that journey. He walks with us through that journey, and I think that's just the best part about healing, with God at the center of it.
And as your like healer and own personal psychologist, if you like, you have access to Him all the time, free of charge. And unconditional love and grace, and it's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I know that's really personal to you, and I'm really thankful that you were able to share that. Thank you, Nini.
Thanks, Mom.
I'm just interested to know, before we move into the last part, you are learning the technicalities of of psychology and the mind and healing and the brain, eh? Like I see you drawing all these diagrams of the brain.
Yeah, it's the worst part of it.
But yes, and you're also a follower of Christ.
Yeah.
And so do you find that they contradict, or like how would you, like do they go hand in hand?
Absolutely.
Really?
Absolutely. There's so many similarities between kingdom principle, or what we learn in the Bible, and psychology. A lot of the times I've read about disorders, I've read about like different types of phenomena that we call, that happens to us like daily, or like types of behaviors that they name, and how we can resolve it. And oftentimes I've been like, I've read this somewhere, and it turns out that it's in scripture. So it's really, they don't go, they're not separate. They go hand in hand 100%.
I love that.
Yeah.
And I just love it because God is the God of everything, and He creates everything. And sometimes we separate things like this and say, okay, this is secular and then this is of God, but everything is of God. Yeah, and it's great that we can approach it that way. So just for this last part, Nia, I was thinking about how we can help people that we see, now that we know a bit about trauma. And you can identify, because it comes out in people's behavior. You can be like, why is this person always so mean, or always talking about other people? Possibly indicates there's some trauma. Like, how do we do that as a friend? Without saying, hey, you need to go to see a counselor, because they're not going to take that very well.
I think the important part is just to walk alongside them. Like, there's so much value in just standing by a person, and they definitely feel how you feel, you know. Like, a lot of people, they just need someone to listen to them without any judgment, and just be able to just sit there and take that first kind of expression of their trauma, you know. And I think along with that, you have to make sure that you're in the right headspace to be able to be there for the other person, because it's very easy for we call it trauma dumping, for them to express their trauma to you and for it to weigh you down. And so taking care of yourself, making sure that you're in the right state of mind to help someone else through their healing journey is so important, because you don't want to get caught up in their trauma and take that on for yourself.
That's so good, because I reckon we fall into that. You know, like I was saying, my experience, my friends has been like, you know, and then they add, you know, people can add fuel to it. It's like, yeah, you're right, and almost like justify you being in the place you are in. Do you think there's anything verbally, like if they're saying things, because you said like be quiet, and that's fine, because I think that's so important. By the way, Melania is like the greatest listener. I'm not inviting you to all like pour out your trauma dump here, but she's a great listener. But when at times do you feel like you say something, like if they start, you know, like saying things that are self-harming to them, like what, do you have any tips on how you could speak life into that situation? I do. So it's very important not to interrupt them as they're kind of expressing that trauma at first, because it can confuse them, and it can also not allow you to have the whole picture of what they're really going through. As you're listening, it's important to listen, to practice active listening. So just little cues, like just letting them know that you're listening, eye contact, body language, allowing yourself to really be present in that moment is super important. And then after they're done, or if they have asked you, what do you think? Then you can speak, and making sure to speak in love. I think also when you mentioned friends being around you in that time, there's so much value in having friends meet you where you're at. And if you're at rock bottom, it's so important to have people beside you to kind of be around you in that time. But you have to make sure that they don't stay there with you at rock bottom. You need friends that will help pull you out of that. You don't want friends that will keep you in that and kind of enable you to stay in that state. So I think that's super important, just to remember you need a help up. You don't need someone to just hold your hand, you know what I mean? That's so good. And while talking about help up, I'm just thinking it would be great if you could listen, if we could listen. But remembering we are not counselors. So
that's true.
I guess fight the urge to try and like give some solutions. Like, I mean, like, you know, like as a counselor would. But I'm just thinking it might be helpful to say, like, yeah, you know, active listening, and then maybe help the person get professional help. And for those who are thinking about costs, I believe it's, do you know how much it is? I think it was $50 an hour or something. And that's a lot of money for some people. If you can afford it, I recommend you go. If you cannot afford it, I recommend you go anyway. And I'm just saying Hope Clinic because our resident psychologist of a SWAN is based there, and I think it would be great just to have a conversation with them to say, listen, I can't afford this, what are some options for me? But maybe as a friend it might be useful to just hold their hand and say, you know what, I'll go with you. If you want me to even sit there with you, I will. But I would encourage us to really normalize going to get professional help, because I always think about how when we get physically unwell, it's so quick to run to the doctor, right? Okay, my physical state is not good. I've got a headache. There's no shame in that. There's no shame in that. And then I've heard also from a lot of medical practitioners that the physical ailments, a lot of the time, it's due to the stress, to mentally, you know, being mentally unwell or unhealthy, or I hope I'm not saying any words that will offend anyone, but just not being okay mentally. So, it makes sense that you would heal from the root. So Nia, I think about this often. I really hope to be around to see the day, especially in this country, where seeking professional help for our mental wellness will become normalized, and not just straight away think, what's something wrong with you mentally? Oh my goodness, you're going to go to St. Giles. You know, it's so horrible, the stigma associated with that. I think we're done. Thank you so much for sharing, you know, how we can identify, but also how we can start on this journey of healing. And I really hope that whoever has identified anything, that you would have the courage to go and to just find help, speak to somebody. You can actually message us on the Life with Liliana show. You can we've received a lot of questions already. We make a lot of connections already with psychologists. And so please, if you get nervous, you don't have anyone to speak to, let us know and we will help you make the connection. But Melania, I just wanted to thank you again. You are a beautiful, brilliant young woman, and I just really love to see how you've really come into your own in this field of psychology. I really believe that you're operating in the gift that God has laid on you, and you're walking in the plan that was created for you before you were placed in my womb, like the word says. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mom. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, that seemed like a lot. I feel like I've just walked through some trauma myself, but I really hope that you enjoyed that. We're going to continue in the next over the next weeks, talking about some stories as well of people who have experienced trauma. And you know, stories are so powerful, and all of you watching have your own story. And how wonderful to think that even if you're in a place now where you don't feel so good, your story one day is going to bring life to somebody. But we need to address that trauma first in order for that to happen. So thank you again for watching. Please share so that other people can watch this. Do not forget, there's behind the scenes content on Liliana Paretti Warid. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook as well, and soon to come on other platforms, so keep an eye out for that. But otherwise, have a great week ahead. Binakbakalevu.